So we have container gardening. The question, it actually, I'm realizing goes hand in hand with herbs because there's a whole lot of herbs you don't want to put in the ground. So, but I'm not going to talk about that. You get to figure that out by trial and error. But why would you do container gardens? Oh, there's a lot of reasons. You've got a small space. You don't have good soil. I've met people who have soil that used to have coal underneath, so they can't plant at all. You don't have, there's tree roots. That's a common question, is there's a horrible tree root or a tree, your neighbor's tree, that you can do nothing about. All those shallow roots, you can't dig worth anything. So that's another reason. You want that separation between weeds and your garden space. It does create a barrier of such to between the two of them. There's the sun is in the wrong spot, so you've got your patio in the sunny spot, which is where you want to sit in the sun and where also the plants want to sit. Or there could just be you're getting older and you don't want to kneel that far to the ground. So tons and tons of reasons. I'm sure there's even more than that you'd want containers, patios, decks, and obviously, yeah, you can see what counts as a container. We'll start with containers over raised beds. Anything can be a container. There's just things that you want to make sure the container has, which I stress more than not is drainage. It needs to have drainage holes of some sort. From there, you're going to get tons of people saying you want to put rocks on the bottom for drainage, and then you don't need the drainage holes. No. You still need the drainage. The rocks, I would say, are almost there more to hold it down. So if it gets windy, if it's not a big container, if it's not heavy, last night it would have gone across your yard, right? So rocks or bricks, if it's a huge container and you don't want to fill it all with soil, you can definitely put rocks or bricks underneath to offset that cost of soil. And then what can be planted in containers? Pretty much anything. Really, it comes down to how you water it and how much you fertilize it, right? So some of the pictures on here, as long as they're not super lime green, like in the top corner, in the Rubbermaid containers, they've got corn in there. You would have to I saw that picture, I'm like, that's anything. You would have to water and fertilize that on a very regular basis, but it will survive because it doesn't need all that much, just needs you to make sure you water it. So you'd be constantly watering. So that's the trade-off. If you're going to put something like corn in a Rubbermaid container, you're going to be watering it. I have no idea how much. There's other kinds of containers. So in the middle there's the peppers that you get at a garden center, right? You see that you can put one pepper into a container and the plant's happy. The more you put into the container, the more you're going to want to water it. So how much do you want to put in that container? How big is it? And how big does the plant get? So like you can see there's the lettuce containers. Those can grow nice side by side. You can have a ton of lettuce in those depending on how big. Again, it just comes down to watering. But if you've got a big tomato plant, then you want to make sure that you don't have two tomato plants or the container's that much bigger. So you just got to play with the size. If they're saying the tomato needs 4 square feet of growing space, you're not going to put 2 of them in a 12-inch pot, which is usually the standard of size of pot that you're going to buy at a garden center unless you get creative and use Rubbermaid or whatever else you have. You want to be cognizant. Now in that huge container, you could put maybe basil at the bottom of it because it's not going to get as tall, and so you can layer the heights of it a little bit and kind of pack as much as you want in there. Again, it comes down to fertilizing and watering. Have I said that enough? Especially if you're on that patio and you've got a deck, which I know a lot of people have said, what can I do on there? You can do anything. I had a front south-facing window at one point, and I was growing tomatoes. I had a tree. I had little peppers growing, and if I forgot to water it, that was the end of it. Because it was inside, it had all the sun and heat it wanted. It just didn't necessarily get any water outside of me. So again, the sky's the limit if you're feeling creative. But yeah, so you can see there is one bag or container I want to bring your attention to in the center there, instead of pointing. This guy. These are called fabric bags. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with those. They are a little different from plastic containers in that they're made out of fabric, more of a felty fabric usually. But what they do is air prune the roots. So the roots don't grow in and get it tangled in the fabric. They actually stop growing when they hit the air. So instead of getting that wraparound root-bound plant that you could get, you have actually nice ending roots. They just naturally stop there. On the other side, they dry out because now there's air all the way around it. So you water it more. You don't want to have that in a spot where it's going to drain onto your patio or carpet because there is no plastic containing it. So inside it might become a little bit of a more mess, but it can be done. And it just keeps the plant from getting root bound, which is actually a good thing. So a lot of people do those. I think it looks like they have sweet potatoes or vines of some sort in there, which actually I was planning on doing in the church garden this year with fabric bags. There's someone in the church who makes them. So, or even I've seen containers like this, raised up that way, just outside of your patio, you want some lettuce, you chop it off, you don't have to go far. We'll get to layout in a little bit. So yeah, again, what else do you put in there afterwards? Potting soil. In a container, never recommend putting topsoil or compost, like garden compost. It's too heavy. I went over this last month, but potting soil is composed usually of peat moss and vermiculite and perlite, which is all, maybe not vermiculite, but perlite, which is designed to keep the soil fluffy and not compact as much, so there's still that drainage. If you put topsoil, which is the nice $2 cheap bag at the garden center, it will compact and you will get a block of mud. And then the roots don't have anywhere to grow, right? So if you're using topsoil, then it's just you're going to compact that soil too much. And as you water it, you're going to notice that level go down, and then it's just going to kind of look like a brick if you let it dry out one day. So potting soil, there's different combinations you can use. There's now cocoa mix or coconut fiber mixes that you can get if you don't feel good about the peat moss. So there's tons of different stuff, but you want something specifically designed for pots. You can also go into trying to make your own combination where you add worm castings and whatnot. But again, I wouldn't add too much stuff that's made for a garden into a pot, just because then you're going to start compacting your soil. So that would be my biggest, that's always my biggest thing, is potting soil for pot mixes or containers. All right. So what can you make the containers out of? Literally everything. If it is holds water or holds dirt, you can make it out of anything. So, I mean, the obvious one is wood, metal. I know people have used old tractor tires, and me and Dana were just talking about it. You can use barrels cut in half, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with the 50-gallon barrels. Talk to Dana. She has a spot where you can get them for free, that they're just trying to get rid of them. She told me where, somewhere on Highway 7 up by Lucan. Yes. There's also a spot by Embro. Embro Farm. Okay, Embro Farm Systems sometimes has them outside the gates as well. So, I mean, really, you can use them. It sounds like most farm places are just trying to get rid of them because they have nothing they can do with them. But make sure you know what was in them before you start putting soil in them. So some stuff is food grade, safe, but try and make sure the label's still on it, and if the label's not on it, you're just gonna wanna rinse that out really well and hope it wasn't glyphos. But I'm just saying, those usually come in smaller containers. But yeah, just be aware of what was in it and how well you have to wash it before you use it. I mean, I've got them collecting rainwater right now out there. Gave them a good rinse. It's great. So the different kinds of wood, the debate whether you use pressure treated wood or cedar wood, it's going to come down to cost. I did read some stuff. Some people were saying they just go ahead and use the pressure treated because the pressure treated that they get now, I mean, she definitely recommended do your own research from your supplier, but it's not using the arsenic that it used to use, so it's not as dangerous, and it won't leach quite as much. So, I mean, cedar's great, but it's going to cost you a ton more than pressure treated. So just do your own research on whether you feel comfortable and what you feel comfortable using, just because wood's not going to necessarily last as long as the metal corrugated ones, which now that I've been searching containers and raised beds, I'm getting tons of ads for. So you can get them in kits, right? So, and then cinder blocks. I mean, those are easy to come by too, and simple to do. So really, when it comes to containers, so raised beds, we'll go over what to put in a raised bed. I mean, something like this, I would still say put potting soil in. You could probably be a little more lenient, but it's still big enough that you could get away with more tops or compost-like stuff, but just be aware of the compaction that could happen. We'll go over what to put in raised beds in a bit. Layout. So now that you know what you're going to make it out of and what you're going to use as the container, where are you going to put it in your yard? So with a raised bed, containers are great because you can move them, right? If the sun's suddenly shifting or whatnot, and you can move them around. Raised beds are a bit more permanent, especially depending on how you install them into the ground. So you want to make sure you've got them in the right spot, right? And the right size. So you want to look at where your sun's coming from. Where's the trees? Like right now, it's probably a really false indicator because none of the trees have leaves. But you remember from last summer where your sunny spot was because your chair's probably not there or it is in the sun, right? Because that's where you are going to want to put most of your raised beds, right? Is where there's sun. Do you want it close to the house? Because the closer to the house it is, the more likely you're going to go out there and grab that lettuce or whatever you want for supper. If it's at the back part of your garden and it's raining and you're like, no, I'm not going back there tonight. So just be mindful like if it's herbs and you want to add that to your cooking or whatnot. And yeah, if it's the closer it is to your house, the more likely you're going to use it. So, and then the size of the beds. So a typical size of the bed, the most important dimension is the width, right? You want to be able to reach the center of that bed without stepping into it. So typically they say max 4 feet wide, because then you've got 2 feet reach to one side and you can go around to the other side, 2 feet to the other side. So if you've got it up against a fence, you don't want to go much more than 2 to 2.5 feet unless you really have a strong reach and you are okay with that bend for a long time, right? Or if it's going to be tomatoes in there a foot into the bed anyway, right? So depending on what you're going to put in there, but that's the guideline. Even with garden beds, I say that 4 feet wide. That way you can, reach the center from all sides without stepping into it. Length, that's not a limiting factor. That you can do as long as you want. Just remember that the longer you make it, the more you have to walk around to the other side. But really, it just, that you buy a bunch of 6x8s at the 8-foot long things. You can make it 8 foot by 4 foot, and then, right, all of a sudden you don't have to buy a whole bunch of random sizes because you've just cut an 8-foot piece of wood in half, and you've got your 2 ends, and then you buy another 8 foot, and you've got an 8 by 4 foot bed, right? Easy. So there's that. That sometimes it's just cost effective to go certain sizes. I mean, so I've got a few layouts. Come on. And they're just being fancy, right? So they've graphed out, which isn't a bad idea. If you take your space, break it into foot, make each little square on your graph a foot, represent a foot, and then that way you can just draw it out and see how it fits. So, right, they've just got it all fancy, and they've kind of plotted in what they're going to put in there as well, so that way they can maximize their space. I've never gotten into square foot gardening myself or in here, but there's tons of resources online that helps. That way, if you've got a graph and each square is a foot, you can easily fill in what you're going to put in everything, right? And it's all kind of plotted out. These guys have it on a corner, so you can be creative. It doesn't have to be a box. And then these things are trellises over top. So you'll see some pictures. To maximize space, they've created a trellis branching from one raised bed to another raised bed, and they'll put their beans or their cucumbers over top of that, and then that way they're not taking up more space on the ground. So you can get creative with your raised beds, and that way you're not building a raised bed just for your squash. That's going to take up a ton of space. The next thing to consider is pathways. So you want to make sure that you can not just get yourself through there and get your wheelbarrow through there, potentially, but that when you kneel down, you have enough room to actually fit between your pathways and not be kneeling awkwardly in a weird angle where you're going to put your back out or bruise your knees. So I would almost actually just measure your knee to foot distance, but 2 feet minimum is probably going to be too small. 3 feet is generally another guideline of getting your wheelbarrow through, being comfortable to sit in there yourself, which is again why you want that length to be as long as you want it, because if you have to put a 3-foot path in there, now you're taking 3 feet up that could have been garden space, right? So just depending, unless you're like, no, I don't need it. It can be a 1 foot or a 2 foot space because I'm just walking through there, just so you have access to go around. So things to keep in mind, because yeah, once you build a raised bed, it is more permanent, right? So lay it out on a piece of paper for sure. Play around with it, see if it works. How are you going to use the space? Construction. So I kind of touched on it. There's kits. You can get kits from anywhere, right? I know Home Depot, I think that's a picture from their website. Easy to put together. You get all the boards, prefab. They've got the slots. Otherwise, it's still also really easy. Some 4x4s, you can put those in the ground if you want, to keep them from raising or shifting on you. And then just hammer in however these, I'm assuming, are 6 inches wide. So then you have a 12-inch height. If you want it lower, you can do the greater or smaller. How to decide the height? The height would be a factor on how much soil, so why are you building up off of the ground? Is it because of the roots? Is it because it's concrete underneath? Then you're going to want it higher because there's nothing for it to grow in underneath. If it's just for your knee's sake or separation of weeds or whatever, then, or the ground's okay, you just don't want to dig in hard, solid clay, you can get away with a smaller height or what you're planting in it. If it's got less roots, it can have a shallower bed. But if you want something with a taproot and you want it to have nice soil, like potatoes or something, then you might want it a little higher. So a few different things to consider, or like I said, cost effective. You get a bunch of so how many would you need? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. 6 pieces of wood to build an 8x4 by 12 bed. So really simple. And then these guys, they've just got it hammered or screwed together at the corners. So depending on how sturdy you want it, you can add the 4x4 or have it simple like that, right? So it really depends on what you want out of the bed, right? Because some of them you might be replacing every 5 years, bit more of a hassle. Come on, right, that direction. All right, so now filling the bed. You have your bed, and now what are you going to put in it? So there's a few, I watched a few things. Some people put landscape fabric underneath. That depends on what you want. Are you trying to keep roots out of it? Then yes, put landscape fabric underneath. Like tree roots, I should say, because those maple trees, they'll come up in and underneath. So yeah, put landscape fabric to try and block those roots from growing up into your garden bed. If it's not that reason, it'll kill once you do this, it'll suppress most weeds naturally, so you don't have to worry about that. So most people would recommend cardboard. Just put a layer of cardboard, make sure there isn't the plastic and as many labels as you can, and you just put that underneath, and that'll just act as a first layer of weed suppressant. It'll break down pretty quick, but by that time the weeds will be gone. Then they say to save money, because filling up these beds with compost, and now you can use topsoil, is going to get expensive. So to figure out how much soil you need, you take your width by height by depth, right? So 3, and that gives you your cubic feet or whatever you've measured in. And then you can go to the garden center and I need X cubic feet. And they'll say, what's that in yards? And then you'll get out Google and calculate that. So yeah, so to save, a lot of people recommended putting larger woody material at the very bottom. So that's quite a bit of wood. Some people did twigs or sticks or whatever they found lying around their house that was blown off their trees today, save it. Or ask a person with a woodlot if you can go in and carefully remove stuff. But if you've got branches and twigs, you can lay those over top. Just the bigger stuff, the stuff that's going to decompose last, put at the bottom. Does that make sense? And then you can fill it in. Then you can put over top. That one quickly just puts topsoil right over top of it. Here's a different kind of layout. You can put then compost, so stuff that'll, after your big woody stuff, put your smaller, you can even put your compost that's not fully developed yet, that will break down over time, and then put your compost in organic soil or organic matter. So, and most people, this ratio is actually not what I found. Most people were doing 50-50 of compost versus topsoil. So it depends on what you can afford, what you need. It is what it is, especially if you've got compost underneath. The roots will get down there. They're saying if you put the first few layers, because that's the most expensive part anyway, is the topsoil and the compost or organic matter. That's going to cost you the money in the soil ranges, right? Because unless you have someone, if you're putting, I know people always say they put chicken compost, let it compost. Don't put straight chicken compost in there because it will burn. If you had luck with it, you're lucky. So yeah, no. So they say put this stuff on the top because it's usable by the roots right away, right? You put your little seedling in there and the roots are this big, so the compost way down here isn't going to do it any good. but it wants something right there, right now, so that way you have your compost, gives it a start, and then as it gets more mature, it can go down, and it will reach the stuff, the uncomposted stuff later once it's ready to handle it, right? So this one is a pretty consistent layer of what I saw. So leaves, garden, lawn clippings, right? Whatever you've got, just to help minimize that cost, really, of just compost and topsoil. What I also would recommend is, as you're layering it, soak the layers as you go. That will help compact those bottom layers, because once you get to the top, yeah, now I'm telling you to compact. Once you get to the top ones, it'll settle naturally. So I saw someone putting twigs in, and then she just kind of put pine things over top, and then she put the gardens, so everything was nice and fluffy, and then within a day, it sunk that much on her, right? And so then she had to put more. So try and compact those bottom layers depending on how not dense they are beforehand, because those are going to start sinking on you. And if you're using the logs, they'll sink on you a little slower because it'll just take time for those to break down. But don't be surprised. The soil's not going anywhere. Your stuff's just breaking down, so now there's less airspace. So it's not leaking out somewhere. The worms aren't carrying it away. I did see this one, and I wanted to bring this to attention. I find that kind of weird. They put all their twigs and grass clippings here, right? And then they put the newspaper in the compost or the cardboard. I don't know because then you're going to put it there and it's all uneven. You're going to put it on, you're going to water it, and it's just going to break anyway. In my head, that's what was happening. I'm like, it's just breaking down unless you have a nice solid layer of all your twigs and grass clippings. Once you put cardboard on there and it gets wet, it's just going to break. So I didn't really see a whole lot of point. I would put the cardboard on the bottom, and then as far as newsprint, well, nobody has newspaper anymore, but I wouldn't actually use newspaper as much. I know a garden center I used to work for used to cover things in newspaper. The ink is actually going to leach into your soil. So I would stay away with newspaper if for some reason you have an abundance of it, like printed newspaper. If you've got packing newspaper that you get out of every Amazon box or whatever, and it has no print, that would be fine. Yes, great. As I was saying, irrigation. I came across a few pictures, which I just wanted to briefly go over. Most people, if it's a raised bed and it's not underneath a roof or something, then you don't have to worry about it outside. You can water it really the same way you're going to water your garden. I just thought because they're all structured, a lot of them had this kind of tubing kind of squared out, and I would put it on before your plants are full size, so that way you're not trying to manipulate your plants. But they've got it, I would say those are probably 1 foot increments, so 1 by 1 squares. You don't even need to have it such a hex pattern. You could just have 1 foot strips going down. And this tubing you can get online super easy nowadays, and even if you don't have a raised bed, you can do this for your garden. Yes.
Slide.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
2 questions.
Yeah.
The straw mulch.
Yeah, the straw on top.
Yeah.
Right. So you can definitely put straw on top. They're trying to suppress weeds probably by putting straw on top. Okay. Which hopefully, because any weeds that you're going to get on top of that huge layer are going to be really small and weak, and you can probably just pull them out. They're not going to be the grass weeds yet from the bottom. So they're trying to maintain moisture, so it'll dry out less. So you're definitely, if you have a source of good straw or hay, you can put that on top, and that will help suppress the weeds and hold in moisture so it doesn't dry out as fast.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And second question, for subsequent years, so let's say you had a container garden last year.
Right.
What are you adding in your second and, ongoing years as the soil gets used and depleted and kind of compressed?
Good question. I would add more compost topsoil mix, right? So you can keep adding, especially as it gets breaks, the bottom layers break down. Add another more topsoil compost organic matter mix over top of it. If it's been a number of years and you're like, there's nothing left in there, you can, and there's no room in your garden, it might be time for you to dig it out and start it over again after a few years.
With the grass clippings, are
Yeah.
you worried about weeds, especially dandelions, being in with it?
See, and I wondered that too, right? I was like, I saw this woman putting dried weeds from last year as the grass clipping layer, and in my head, I'm going, wait, no, those seeds are still there. So, in my head, yes. I was worried about those seeds. That's legit, but they, from their experience, were like, it's so deep that it doesn't, like, as long as you bury it and they don't see the light of day, hopefully it doesn't come up. And because there's that, yes, Christy.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that.
Yeah.
If you compost your grass clippings a bit first, the heat in your compost pile will kill any of the seeds.
That's true too.
But if you're comfortable, just don't do a really thick layer because you can get mold. Like I find the grass clippings, if they have the moisture, will mold.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add about the straw/hay. I don't recommend hay. You want to make sure it doesn't have the seeds, like
Oh, yeah.
the top part of it. But a lot of farmers actually spray their hay and straw before they cut it. They just so that all the grasses that are there are dead. So make sure you know where you're getting them, because if they had been sprayed, they're literally just going to kill everything in your garden.
That's fair. Yeah. That's clarification for a good source of hay. Yeah. Yes. Whoa. I know I won't.
Wood chips are really excellent mulch.
Wood chips are, yes.
Just not the first year you cut them, because they will take all the nitrogen out of your garden.
Yeah. Dry wood chips, yes. Has Christy had experience?
I mean, just for the wood chips, I've also, you can get free wood chips from the city, but you do have to be mindful it could be a lot of black walnut.
Yeah.
Definitely know what tree you're sourcing from. Otherwise, you're
Yeah.
in for a whole lot of trouble.
So for raised beds, I don't know that I would necessarily use wood chips as much as I would try and find hay if I was trying to do that top layering. Or straw, I should say, not hay. But yes, that wood chips will work. Yes, there was another question.
Just a comment, the
Yeah.
wood chips will block your weeds. You don't use it in volume though. As soon as you bury your wood chips, it'll use up your nitrogen. If you have the wood chips just on the surface, then it won't use up the nitrogen. And if you get wood chips that are the tip branches of the tree, that's like your fertilizer right there. So that's super fertilizer.
Yeah, so it can work with or against what you're doing, depending. So to go on that comment, if you use wood chips or even if you use the straw on the top, the next year, instead of just burying that into your soil, clear it off your soil. And then if you need new, so then that can either go to your new compost height, but don't mix it into your soil, because then that just kind of, you want it to clear off, and maybe they're still not broken down enough, you can put it back on after you plant. But generally people replace that each year with something else, which would hopefully help with the weeds in the grass clippings, right? But like Christy said, and I had thought about it and then I forgot, yeah, the heat, because you've got that layer of topsoil underneath and it's breaking down underneath, there is that natural composting and breaking down of weed seeds on its own. So just as long as you don't dig and suddenly mix up if you're digging and mixing, don't dig into that grass clipping layer. because then you're going to bring those glass clippings up to the surface where they can now be exposed to air and germinate. So wait a few years, probably, or just leave it. Let it just go down. Did that answer your question? Yeah? Okay, good. Yeah. Right, I want to do that way. This is interesting. You could probably, I showed this because people love putting rocks at the bottom of containers. And this is just O tubing. So it's probably O tubing with holes in it. And actually in my head, when I saw that, I was like, ooh, that's a good drainage idea. So if you're on concrete, and that's why you're building your raised bed, you could do something like that. I would put a sleeve over your O tubing, and then that would, and have an exit, so that way when it pours rain, your raised bed isn't becoming a bathtub. So that would help drainage on the flip side. If you wanted to do irrigation, which is what it was trying to show, and have water going in it, I don't know, depending on how old the plant is, it didn't seem as effective in my mind, because you're watering from below and there's nothing forcing that water up, it's gonna wanna go down. So, but for drainage, if you're planting on something on clay soil or on concrete and you don't want it to become a bathtub, that would be a great idea. Something like that, just O tubing, you could, and that way it just gives the area a place to, all the water to go out. Right, so yes, back to this, drip systems, you would hook that up to your hose, turn that on, and it would just automatically water all of your beds for you. Handy if you have it in your garden bed. I keep trying to do it out there, and I just haven't had the success with getting my pump working in that way that I have hooked up. We're getting there, and it's a lot of money. Okay, so yeah, so your finished product can be really whatever you desire, right? Like, that's pretty stinking fancy. But you don't have to have, it doesn't have to be boring. It can look as fancy or as purposeful as you want. This is the, I was talking about the trellises going over top of the raised beds. So those are how your trellises could be, just simple lattice over top, and then that creates more space for growing. This one I liked because that was another reason you might want to raise bed, is to keep the critters out. So they really raise this bed, and then they put fencing around it. I bet you they have deer or something. That just keeps them from having snacks or, right, I didn't even touch critters, right? So that, I did see one then that even went as far to put a mesh over top. So yeah, something was eating their food. So that's another reason you might have a raised bed, is to keep even the rabbits out. So if you were keeping groundhogs or rabbits out, then we're gonna go back because I just got on another bunny trail. I didn't. I did that by mistake. At this stage, you could even put a wire mesh or something underneath. So if you've got groundhogs coming up, or whatever wants to burrow, you could put a wire mesh on the bottom. That would still allow the moisture to go out, and the roots would still be able to, if it's not deep enough, go in and keep all your things from crawling into it. So whether it's rabbits, you could even, at the point of building, if you're feeling really adventurous and you can dig in, you could even put your box, sink it down a little bit, and that would help keep stuff from burrowing under. But really, yeah, if you put wire mesh, staple that around, that would help keep things at bay as well. So that's definitely another reason to have a raised bed, because you can't do that successfully in a garden. Cool. So that, I hope, gave you a bit more confidence, and so now you can go. Where was I going to go? I did hear cautions, because now that we're going to go into the herbalism, hi Dana, about growing perennial herbs in these. So if you're going to put perennial herbs into containers, containers are fine. I would almost try and move your containers to overwinter them to a sheltered spot. So if you've got them all nice and laid out somewhere where there's your most sun for the winter, take those containers, move them if it's a perennial and you want it to come back next year, somewhere sheltered, kind of grouped together so that way they're keeping each other warm. Even if you put a drop cloth over top, not a drop cloth, but like some sort of cloth over top to help protect from the elements, just to keep the root balls warm, because you don't have them in the ground, they don't have that natural insulation. Now their poor root tips are touching plastic, touching freezing snow, right? So you want to kind of group them and huddle them together somewhere. Most will survive pretty well, but in raised beds, remember they're going to start spreading. So if you want to do a mix of perennials and annual plants, your perennials are going to keep growing. So I'm thinking of some stuff, particularly peppermint. It will quickly take over. That's why they're great for containers. If you want that in your raised bed, you're going to still be looking at splitting them as if they were in the garden. But just a caution that I came across was if you're doing perennials in raised beds, know that they're going to keep spreading and you're going to they're going to do what they do in the garden. They're not going to be contained anymore. So you're going to have to split them and treat them the same as if they were in the ground. And they'll each year take up more space that you might have used for annual plants. So just added maintenance depending on what you're looking to do. Did that make sense? Yes, a few head nods. Good. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. No, it's okay.
Do you suggest planting the same types of plants in the same raised garden bed or container each year?
Good question. No, I don't. That is a trick, and I know we covered it last year a little bit in companion / crop rotation, because something like the tomato is going to take up a whole lot more nitrogen, and then so there is recommended rotation. So after tomatoes, you would plant beans because they trap nitrogen, right? And then you could plant something else. Plus, as well, if that tomato or squash or zucchini got blight, you want to move it now because that blight's in the soil. So I guess on the upside, if that blight's in the soil and then after a few years you put tomatoes there and they get it again, you may have to dig out that soil and put brand new stuff in, right? So that's the advantage, is you're able to dig that soil out, whereas in the garden you can't. But yes, you do want to be able to rotate them. So if we go to the layout page, so you can see they've got these pretty tomatoes and then they've got the cucumbers and peppers. Some people actually will plan their garden so that they can just shift it all. So then the next year, tomatoes will be here, zucchinis will be here, and then peppers will be here or something, right? So they're just shifting and rotating depending on the recommendations of what should follow each year, because there are, like, if you're using corn, that's why farmers rotate corn and soy, right? Corn sucks everything out. The soy traps the nitrogen for them. So definitely in containers, you want to do the same, because you've got even less resources. You're now containing your resources in this one spot. So if you wanted the tomatoes, if you don't have the space to do that kind of rotation, then you're going to put more compost in. And if you don't have enough space, then you're going to be digging soil out to put more compost in. You will want to fertilize more. Yeah. Heather.
I do container gardening.
Yeah.
And do you have any specific fertilizer tips, or is it just the standard fertilizer that you use kind of in every situation?
Yeah, you don't want to necessarily, the stuff you get at the stores, they work, right? Like the chemical ones, there's nothing in essence wrong with them. I did fertilizing last week or last month. I hope it made sense to those who heard it. but I would use the same kind of guidelines with the fertilizing of finding a well-balanced for what you're growing fertilizer. So organic ones are great, but they might only have one of the three numbers or two of the three numbers, whereas the plant will need a lot of other number, like the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Did I get that in the right order? And a lot of organic ones will only have maybe two of those numbers and not enough of the third. So you're going to want to play around and mix them to be sufficient for your plants. So, because yeah, especially in small pots, that'll be the first to go is fertilizer. So make sure if you're buying organic stuff, you can use the worm castings, you can use, in bigger raised beds, you can use the soil stuff a bit more freely because you've got more space to do that. They're not as high in fertilizer as the chemical stuff. So if you need more, you would have to add more organic to equal the chemical ratios. I'm trying to make sure I'm making sense and not babbling. So it will just take experimenting to get it right. So if you're not seeing improvements in your plants, it may still be something missing in the fertilizer. So if tomatoes at a certain time, tomatoes will need more of the middle number because it goes nitrogen, it grows up, potassium, am I in the right order? NP. Nope, phosphorus is roots and flowers, so up, down, and then all around. So if it's fruiting time for your tomatoes, you want more of that middle number because that's flowers, right? So if you're not getting the same fruit, it might be that you need more of that middle number. Yeah. There's two people, yeah.
Okay, go ahead. You're standing up. Go ahead.
So my son Evan had a really good question. So
Oh,
we have, in our container, we have cherry tomatoes that drop and
Yes.
reseed every year.
Yes.
So we don't plant them.
Right.
Would they stop growing at the time that we would need to rotate them?
No. So, like, what do you mean,
Like, if the soil was depleted in that area, is that, or do you know what I'm trying to ask? Like, they're
Yeah.
dropping, they're reseeding.
And they're just going to keep doing that. So even if they won't be as healthy. So if they keep growing in that spot over and over again, so the tomatoes, right, they're the last seeds to compost out. Like, they take forever to compost tomato seeds, and they'll just grow anywhere. They just won't have the same fruit or healthiness. So if you don't want your tomatoes there, physically you're just going to have to pull them out if it's time for them not to be in that spot, because they'll still grow even if they don't have enough of what they need. They just won't be as happy looking, right? So yeah, no, tomatoes will just keep coming up if you don't compost them long enough. They just like to do that. Did that answer it? Okay.
So I had a question about watering perennials in pots.
Yes.
When they die back in the fall,
Yeah.
do you have to continue watering to keep this moisture in the soil, or does
Right.
it matter?
Good question. I would give them one last watering so they don't go to bed in the winter dry. And then they should, as long as it starts to freeze and do normal winter things, it should be okay. If for some reason we're having a hot spell, and they're not underneath where natural moisture can reach them, I would give them a check. If they're living outside, if they're I'm assuming they're living outside, yeah. Give them a good watering in the fall. Hopefully then it'll maintain its moisture through the winter. If you check it at some point and it's not wet, I would water it. Yeah. I know we did that at garden centers to put them to bed. You'd water them and kind of keep them where they can get moisture and hope that it was frozen enough. So you do want them to go to bed frozen and wet, because if you let them dry out, then that's bad in the opposite direction of rot. Yeah. Good questions. Anything else? We're all prepared? You're all ready? Perfect. Thank you, guys.